A very, very warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to the second Spotlight series. It's something that AIYD has been curating with great love and dedication. And we especially welcome Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, Governor of New South Wales. We also welcome all our emerging leaders, which is our AIYD family, really, and of course, the representatives of the AIYD partner organizations. It's great to have all of you on this forum again. Even though we are divided digitally, this seems to unite us across geographies and continents. I am especially pleased to be part of this very stunning quartet, as you can see, and you will hear from all these fantastic women. But before that, let me extend a very warm welcome to Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley. She is the 39th Governor of New South Wales, as you all know. Of course, you will hear much more about her illustrious career through Sanushka in the course of this conversation. But Her Excellency has, prior to her appointment as Governor, enjoyed a very long and distinguished career in the world of law. And I think that in itself is huge inspiration for all our young leaders listening in. The conversation will be moderated by Sanushka Siyamangal. She's partner at the prestigious law firm Thomson Geer. She's board member of the Australia-India Council, national vice chair of the Australia-India Business Council, also founder steering committee member of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. In fact, in 2018, Sanushka was named by the Australian Financial Review as one of the 100 women of influence in Australia. We completely agree. But aside from all those glowing accolades for us, she's Sanu. She's founding member of AIYD. She's the very reason that we are what we are today. So she holds a very special place in our heart. Thank you, Sanu, for moderating this chat. I want to very briefly walk our audience through some housekeeping rules before we get this conversation going. It will be a 20-minute moderated conversation between Her Excellency and Sanushka, followed by 20 minutes of question and answer. Thank you very much to our alumni who've already written in with their questions. One request, when you are indeed called upon to ask your question, do switch your video on so we can see you, identify yourself, and of course a request to keep your questions short and specific. For those who'd still like to ask a question once the conversation begins, do just type it into the Dropbox, and time willing, we will certainly try and adjust and accommodate your question as well. Thank you very much. Without further ado, it's over to these two wonderful women. Sanu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Vitali, for that very generous introduction. Your Excellency, AIYD alumni, partners, stakeholders, and steering committee, welcome and thank you for joining us today. At the outset, while this is a virtual gathering, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my tribute to elders past, present, and emerging. Before I formally welcome Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACQC, I would also like to acknowledge the wonderful efforts of Manu and the steering committee in not just the presentation of an engagement that is a delightful combination of welcome and stimulating in an environment where death by webinar is a catchphrase, but continuing to hold AIYD in great esteem. On behalf of the founders, I sincerely express our gratitude. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACQC, 39th Governor of New South Wales. As a fellow member of the profession, Her Excellency is an aspirational ideal for me, not just because of her long-spanning career as a lawyer, barrister, and judge, or because she's a role model for women in law, or indeed for the trailblazing pathbreaker she was as the first woman to sit as a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, the first woman appointed to the Court of Appeal, and subsequently the first woman appointed as its president, but more for the two personal experiences I've had with her. The first one was when she spoke at a dinner for a conference on the experiences and challenges that migrant women face in Australia. I expected the very usual, very typical, very politically correct address, but I was sadly and badly mistaken. Her Excellency shared, in a brutally honest way, one that is rare in our profession, her challenges and her obstacles, acknowledging the ugliness and the nastiness that also exists, and how, amongst other things, the cheekiness of her attitude and her approach was how she very successfully overcame them. And I hope she'll share some of that today. And the second was when a meeting I was having at Government House with Her Excellency's husband, the charming Dennis Wilson, also a member of the profession, was cheerfully interrupted so we could be escorted through the bowels of Government House to the kitchen, where I found myself along with staff at Government House singing happy birthday to Her Excellency and her husband. It was the most wonderful insight into the warmth, humility, and generosity of spirit so characteristic of Her Excellency, and certainly affirmed to me why, when I grow up, I'd like to be her. And on that note, welcome, Your Excellency. And so to start us off, and this question is two-pronged. How have you been, so from a personal perspective, how have you been coping with the lockdowns, the isolation impacts of COVID-19? What's changed for you? What's been the most challenging part? What's been the shining light or the one positive change that's happened for you personally? And I guess the second part of that is, in the context of our profession, what, in your view, have been some of the obvious changes and impacts? You know, some of the good and bad consequences of the way we've had to change, or the way we've had to be more creative around how we approach things from a justice or legal profession point of view?
Well, probably the highlight for me of COVID is that on a Wednesday morning, prior to the shutdown, I would have to roll out of bed at about 6:20 in order to get up to the middle of the city to find a decent place on the yoga floor to do my yoga. Now I roll out of bed at about 6:50. I roll my mat out, I go on Zoom, and I do my yoga lesson on Zoom. That's an absolute highlight. I'm going to find it very difficult to get myself, I think, back into the swing of things of going back into the yoga studio. But look, from a personal point of view, of course there are impacts, but here in Government House we are very privileged, and I don't take that lightly in any way whatsoever. First of all, it's a big house. Our residence is upstairs, so we actually don't have to go out. We don't have to be have that concern about that degree of mixing. We live surrounded by the Botanical Gardens in Sydney, so that's where we can walk. And of course here in Australia, we didn't have the restrictions such as they had in England, where you could only go out for 1 hour a day. If you wanted to walk for 2 hours, you could go out for 2 hours. You were, in the early days, restricted to 2 people, sort of doing exercise together. But, so that all made the entire thing easy. For us here in the house, we had to do a very quick turnaround and say, how are we going to make sure that we continue to be a productive government house where we do the things that are most important. The most serious concern for us, of course, is the constitutional role, where we sign off on the legislation, and that occurs every Wednesday morning just after my yoga, so I'm in a good mood. And the ministers, we had our executive council meeting, the ministers would come. We went into the social distancing aspect of everything. That had to be kept going. We made a very quick decision that we would continue to do everything on Zoom. So, instead of going into the regional towns, we would do a program by engaging with various institutions, entities, communities in regional towns. And we literally have a Zoom meeting with them. Does it work well? The answer is yes, it works very well. Are there downsides to it? Of course there are downsides to it. You don't actually see what it's like to be out there. If you're dealing with an old-aged facility, you don't know what's going on in the facility. If you're dealing with a hospital, you don't see how they're dealing with it. If you're dealing with the business chamber of the local community, they can tell you what's happening, but you don't always have quite that sort of personal interaction. But we have found it hugely successful. As Dennis would say, I've become a video star. I do a video, about 4 video messages a week to various organisations. We do a lot of messaging. Before Easter, I wrote about 4,000 letters to 2 groupings, schools. I wanted to get a letter to every school before Easter because the teachers, the students, the principals were really struggling at that stage. So I really wanted to get them a message to say, we know it's really tough and how fantastic it is. And we likewise did a mail out to we wrote to every hospital in New South Wales, and likewise we made them. So that just gives you an indication of the way we've been able to adapt very, very quickly. The other thing I've done, and I'll know we'll have to move on very quickly, but the other thing I've done, which I have actually found both very enjoyable and very useful, is when I do get a spare half hour, I will ring up one of the mayors of the regional local councils. And sometimes I find them in the sheep paddock. Sometimes I find them wandering down the street, sort of to buy their lunch in the little country towns. And I just have a conversation with them for half an hour. They don't know I'm going to ring. And I find that very, very helpful because they're not prepared, so they haven't got a script, and they just tell you how they're going. And the big message just coming out of the regional towns is they've worked very, very hard to get the messaging out to the community, and the communities were very resilient and and really sort of very responsive to the messaging. So in effect, we just switched the program onto Zoom.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you.
And then I think you wanted to get to how the profession generally is. Yes. Look, I think that's a mixed bag. My connection with the profession, of course, is for the most part with the judges and with the barristers. It was very concerning, again, in the first fortnight. I think everyone was just, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Everything had to stop immediately. And again, it was a question of, we have to go online. We just cannot shut down. What sort of court cases are suitable to be heard online? What's our technology like? You'd have to say at the beginning it was pretty terrible. Some courts didn't even have technology, and it was a really, and not only did the courts not have the best or the technology or the best technology, if barristers were at home, often their technology wasn't very good. So there was huge connectivity problems. So there were quite a number of cases which started and just had to be finished, stopped and adjourned. But I think then a number of things happened. The Attorney General here in New South Wales reacted very quickly and really assisted the courts with upgrading the technology all the way through Supreme Court, District Court, Local Court. And barristers just got used to it sooner rather than later, because at the end of the day, I mean, there's nothing like having a financial incentive. And because the cases were going on, the financial incentive was them to get themselves up to speed about how to use their own technology so as to be able to come in. Jury trials had to stop, as you might imagine. One jury trial was part heard, and they decided to continue that. And what they did is they spaced the jurors out all around the courtroom. So they took them out of the jury box and had 12 people spaced all around the courtroom, and otherwise sort of worked with the witnesses more in the well of the court. And then, of course, they had to turn over an entire court for their deliberations because the jury deliberation room itself didn't accommodate the spacing that was necessary. So, but except for that one trial, they stopped them. When they got them going, well, they're about to get them going again. And I think it seems to be working reasonably well anyway.
Yeah, I think there've been some some changes that will be implemented into the longer term across the board. And while I'm not a litigator, we're definitely seeing this even from a transactional perspective, and in things like how the regulators are interacting, how we're able to interact with them. There's an almost more human element in the exercise of their discretions now than I think we had previously. Although I guess the other side of that coin is, almost an overstep into matters that are purely commercial. So I think there will be some shift around that in terms of how we move forward, but it's kind of a bit of a watch.
Yeah, that's really interesting comments, Sunishil, because you've been able to make that comment from, from on the ground, from your own experience. There was an article, I don't know whether you've had time to pick it up yet, but there was an article in this morning's Australian coming out of Gilbert and Tobin, which it was entitled Pandemic Offers Lessons in Better Governance. And one of the points that they do make in that is that there really had been, and I'll quote this, it says, the emergence of a more collaborative ecosystem between regulators and the private sector in response to the crisis, which is the very thing I think you've just said. And it's talked about, the main regulators, ASIC, ASX and the ACCC, all swiftly moved to relax technical strengths on the ability of corps to raise capital and the like. So, and of course, there was a lot of sort of very responsive work in the areas, for example, of insolvency, sort of increasing the minimum amount for which you could put in a letter of demand, sort of a notice of demand, 6 months rather than 21 days, things like that, which I think would have had a huge impact in keeping businesses afloat. Now, what's going to happen in a few months' time is the big uncertainty that I think we're presently living with. And there's a lot of talk in the commercial newspaper sectors about the zombie companies and the like, but we're yet to see that. And I think what's happening here is very positive, and we can keep at that level. It'll be tough, but I think we might be able to sort of just stay on top of a very difficult time.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case. I think the other thing that we've certainly been seeing through this process is, an increase in automation and automated decision making, or, even the data connection and analysis, or even the artificial intelligence in investigation. And it's certainly becoming more and more pervasive. Good or bad thing?
Look, that's true. It's just before I took up this role, I was appointed to an advisory committee that of a project that is being undertaken by the Human Rights Commission at the moment. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this project, but it's really looking at human rights in the context of artificial intelligence. The idea being to work out what's going on in the realm of artificial intelligence at the moment and see if you could embed human rights principles. We, of course, don't have at a national level a human rights charter or act, but still people do talk about rights, and amongst other things, you can talk about privacy as a right. And the whole idea of this project was to be proactive and constructive in seeking to set something up before the artificial intelligence world completely overtook us all. And so I've sort of been able to stay on the edge of that, and that's been very, very interesting. Amongst other things, there are 29 pieces of Australian Commonwealth legislation which allow the use of algorithms for decision making. Now that's quite significant, and of course they are in quite often in sort of the bulk areas, if I can put that, Social Security Act, Customs Act, Biosecurity Act, things like that. And we've had our own bad result in that area, if I can put it that way, with robo-debt.
Yep.
It was, it's now, it got to court. There was a huge amount of publicity about it. There was a class action. The liability of the class action aspect settled before the court on the basis that the information that was in effect prepared, and I'll use very basic language here, fed into the computer, was not able to be, you could not satisfy anyone that actually represented the debt of the individual. And that's actually why, at the end of the day, the liability aspect was has been accepted by the government, and it's now going to that sort of working out of what the entitlements are of the individual litigants. But in a discussion the other day in this area, I expressed, perhaps there are two things of interest. One, I expressed the view, because I have seen it already in litigation, is that everybody worries about the output because that's where the impact is and where you get affected. The real analysis has to take part at the input stage. And that's in fact where robo-debt fell down,
Yes.
in the input stage. So there really needs to be some fashioning around that as to the best way to proceed and how to ensure that the material which is used for the development of the algorithm is going to have a successful result. The other area here which was important, and this is still in development stage, the report is not out, it's still in consultation stage, but certainly amongst the regulators who are users of artificial intelligence, they were not keen on having an overarching artificial intelligence regulator. What was interesting, though, was that there was a feeling amongst those regulators that they would appreciate a place to be able to go, that is an authority which was, highly expert, it would have to be highly expert, who could assist when there were problems, who would have an ethical standard that could be used. Not a regulatory standard, but just a standard and a body where there could be consultation with that body, non-binding advice sought from a very, very high degree of experts. So things are going to happen in this field, but at the moment we're a long way from it. At the moment, under the judicial review proceedings, you can't even, the law seems to be that an artificially generated decision is not a decision which is judicially reviewable unless it can be struck out in the way it was in the robo-debt case. So I think Australia's still got quite a lot of thinking to do in this area.
I think we've definitely got a long way to go. I think the law hasn't yet quite caught up. So I think we were meant to segue into a discussion on corporate governance, but I'm mindful of time. So Your Excellency, I want to cover the two additional matters we discussed earlier this afternoon, which I think are probably far more interesting and relevant, as they're issues that globally are quite significant, but particularly for Australia and for India. And the first one is really in the context of diversity and women in leadership. I've watched in the past few days that Julia Gillard, the former Australian Prime Minister, and indeed the first woman Prime Minister of Australia, is in the process of releasing a new book where she speaks about women in leadership in the context of the stories of 8 high-profile women leaders. And amongst the things that many things she covers, one of the things that comes through is about how the continuation of stereotypes and the unconscious bias and tokenism in addressing diversity, it's continuing to hinder, I guess, the progress of women in leadership and their success, and indeed the entry of other women into leadership, whether in Australia or in India. Like we see it in the representation of women on the bench, or whether at Queen's Counsel, in partnership at large law firms. I was talking to Manu earlier this week. I understand, I think out of 30 Supreme Court judges in India, only 3 are women. How much or how little, in your view, has changed? What role, do emerging leaders have to play, or what responsibility, indeed, do they have to play in this space, or to take in this space? Because I think the change is just a bit too slow.
It's really interesting. At one level, the difference between when I started and now is the difference between day and night. Having said that, the core problems seem to have remained, just as you have indicated. I can remember when I was first appointed to the bench and I had my first associate, my first research assistant, and she was telling me her experiences in her law firm that she had come from. And I have to tell you, I was gobsmacked at that point because it was, you know, sort of 20 years on. And I thought, don't tell me these things are still happening. Like, I can remember very clearly one small thing. This is not an harassment thing, but it just shows you the conditions they were subjected to. So she was entitled to use a secretary of the partner to whom she worked, but the secretary would refuse to do all the things that a secretary would do, an administrative assistant would do, photocopying, scanning, those you know, sort of very basic, well, they're not basic, they're very essential, but they are administrative tasks which don't require, you know, they can't be charged out at the same rate. And she eventually said to the secretary, she said, look, I understand you don't think you have to do this for me, and I understand that that's because I'm a girl like you. She said, but I can assure you, I'm going to have to bill this at the rate that my partner says I have to bill. And I will explain when I'm questioned on this billing, why this bill is this much. So she had to stand up in that sense. But the stories you hear are really still very saddening, I think. You know, there are still a huge number of blockages along the way. And then, of course, you have the you have quite another problem. You have sexual harassment, but you also have sexual conduct where 9 times, if not 10 times out of 10, the female seems to come off worse when the consensual sexual relationship seems to come to an end. And those things are difficult. I mean, I went through all of those things. For example, I was vetoed from a floor of chambers because the head of chambers didn't think that women, you should have women barristers on the floor because, you know, there might be an affair, you know. And if there was an affair, well, of course, the woman barrister would have to go. So you deal with that by not assuming people can be adults, and if they have a consensual affair and or relationship, if it comes to an end, it's got to be dealt with. His reaction was, well, you don't have the women there at all. So that meant that you couldn't get chambers, or you couldn't get chambers on a commercial floor because of that sort of an attitude. And this just continues to play itself out in all sorts of different ways, but it's a really blocking sort of thing. The sexual harassment is, I'm afraid, seems to be terrible. Did myself, did other people in sort of about the same, I'll restrain myself from using the word vintage. Were we subjected to it? Of course you were. Of course you were. You know, I mean, I lost an entire part of my work because a particular partner, I wasn't interested in the partner. So that wasn't, no actual harassment went on in that situation, but because I was not responsive, lost all that work, you know, and I can't tell you how hard it was for women to get work in those days, particularly in commercial areas or taxation areas, which were the areas I was in. So what do you do about it? I can assure you the women barristers are struggling with this at the moment. They are taking sort of quite positive steps about it. They've been really working hard within the Bar Association to make sure that very strong statements are being made. I think in the future, in the renewal of practicing certificates, there will have to be a statement as to whether any allegations have been made against you in that regard. But then you rely upon people's honesty.
Yes.
And
honest, imagine that.
yes, yeah. So we get back to this: how do you change the culture? How do you change a culture of a profession which just thinks that this is appropriate conduct.
Yeah, and you know, you would think that in this age of, you know, social media and how public just about every success and folly is, that it would somehow act as a deterrent, but it hasn't. I mean, look at what's happened even here with our own former High Court Justice, you know, just most recently, and you know, the sexual harassment of young associates over many years. And I think the saddest part about that whole situation was that people knew, and it's you know, I read something, and it's one of remind myself of often, you know, it's almost worse if you stand by and do nothing, and that's
you've really raised an important point, Sanushka. As part of the policy that the Women Lawyers Association is trying to develop is what they call the bystander policy. That is, you know, the person who sees it really does have a responsibility to call it out. Now, that then raises the question, well, how do you call it out? Do you approach the person who you think is sexually harassing another person or bullying another person? Do you go and speak to them? Do you report it back into your association? And if you do, what are then going to be the consequences? I mean, we have seen a couple of cases now where defamation claims have been brought when there has been a report of sexual or harassment or inappropriate sexual conduct. Is that what you're opening yourself up to? You know, so there's a lot of chilling effects that and chilling circumstances that are likely to hold people off. What if you go and challenge X and say, look, I see you doing this, or X told me that you do this, and, you know, mate, you've got to stop it. Yeah. What are they going to do? I suspect 5 out of 10, if not 9 out of 10 responses would be, I can't say it because I'm on social media. I can't use that language. But that's what I suspect. So they really are, the women lawyers are really struggling with how to get this message across so as to actually make the change. But the bystander approach is one that they're very strong on seeking to promote. So it's not only the victim who might, or the person who's the recipient of unwelcome approaches, etc., because not always actual harassment. Sometimes it just can be approaches that they just don't want to have. So is it always for that person to be protecting themselves and be standing up for themselves? So where does that person get the support from? And that's where the bystander concept comes in.
Yeah. Okay, it'll be certainly interesting to see how all of that evolves. But before I get wrapped on the knuckles for not allowing other people to be able to speak with you, I'm going to ask one last question before we throw to some questions that have come through. And I suppose it's just bringing it back to the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. You know, in the context of the bilateral relationship, and obviously you're seeing it because, you know, New South Wales has a sister relationship with Maharashtra. You know, you see it in your general interaction, whether it's with diaspora, whether it's with Indian business. You know, what role do you think younger people in the context of AIYD can have? You know, what role can the AIYD as an organization play in the further development of that bilateral point of view?
The great advantage that I think you've got is that you really are a very dynamic group of young professionals. So you have the ability to do your jobs very well. That's the first thing. I always used to say to women, not everyone can be charging out and you know, sort of waving the flag and holding the flame. There's to be said for women doing their work and doing it very well. And quite often it's as you get more senior, you're able to sort of perhaps stand up, make the statements, pick the issues, decide where to go. Now that's in a gender role. In your role, in terms of the community, I think it's not much different. You're highly professional. You're all doing extraordinarily well. You have your you make your connections with business in any event, through your roles, and takes itself into bilateral relationship as you start to put people together. Because a lot about, bilateral relations are bilateral relations. It's a matter of finding two groups who might have an interest. And you're right in the middle of all of that happening. You're dealing with Australian business. You have Indian contacts. You may well be dealing with Indian business. And it's the way you pull those together. And I think it's the combined resource you have of being in a group, which then gives you some strength in that.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much, Your Excellency. I believe we've now got a series of questions. I could speak to you all day, and I'll make sure I'll invite myself over to tea so we can do just that.
Absolutely.
But I understand. We've got questions now, and I think the first question is from Sean Starr, former chair of the Australian Youth Dialogue.
Hello, Sean.
Your Excellency, nice to see you again, albeit virtually. I'll keep my question very broad, and I've got a number of potential questions that could stem from the discussion so far. I want to sort of go back to your inauguration, I guess one of the first press releases when you became Governor of New South Wales, and it was then that you mentioned there are sort of three pillars or three focuses of your role as Governor, being education, community, and the rule of law, all of which you've been a flag bearer for in previous avatars as well. But I want to focus on the first of those, because I suspect, given the number of lawyers on this call, you will get other questions about the rule of law and democracy coming anyway. So just focusing on education, what role do those of us in education at all levels have in promoting some of the key themes you've talked about, whether it's diversity, whether it's rule of law, community, and what impact has COVID had on this? And finally, what can we do in light of the current circumstances in terms of the bilateral relationship? So I know you are an adjunct at one of the leading universities in India, and have hosted a number of events at Government House focusing on bilateral education between Australia and India. In light of everything that's happening, what do we have to shift our focus, and if so, how?
That is a broad question. Look. In terms of education, even that there's a hold on education at the moment. There's a whole bunch of kids here in Australia who have scholarships to places all around the world, and they can't go. So COVID's had an extraordinary impact just in that very, very small group of, sort of almost really elite students, I'd say. In terms of students generally, I'm sort of going to twist this question in a different direction, if I may, because a lot of it is about relations and interactions and how we do that well. Some of this hits questions of racism, okay? Because that can be a problem in this area, and I think it's not bad to talk about these things. But I like to talk in the Australian context of one of the really good things about Australia is that it's normal to be different. And now, in many ways, it's a bit more aspirational than it is the truth. But if if it's the way you get enough people thinking, then it is normal to be different. And that then becomes easier when you're starting to deal with even bilateral relations, for example. You know, you're not dealing with something foreign, you're not dealing with something strange. In the business context, you've got whole lots of regulatory frameworks and things like that. But in terms of education and those relationships, I think it's the way we interact with each other personally. In terms, if you're going to then turn this into what is your business, if education is a business, then I think there's no doubt that Australia will become much more diversified in the international pool that it brings in. But it's probably just as important for those relationships to go back, not only from the students who have been here, but what about the high-level research, high-level scientific research and things of that nature? So there's a lot to promote, I think, and I think the promotion is to you look for the opportunities. Look at the opportunities. I mean, if you're talking about education, where are our best connections? Well, they're close to everywhere because similar, at least a Westminster common law system in terms of law. You've got a language which is common. Engineering is engineering wherever you are in the world. I think they even make cricket pitches in India, you know. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering you, Sean, or whether I've really hit on what you were sort of getting at, but it was a pretty broad question. And I think it's where you build those bilateral relations and where they work. Scientific research is got to be a big area in the future.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Sean. The next question is from Talish Ray, another trailblazing lawyer in Delhi with a particular strength, in my view, on gendered related issues. So Talish, over to you.
Thank you, Sanushka. Thank you, Your Excellency. Embarrassment as a litigating lawyer, it's always wonderful to hear women trailblazers before us talk and acknowledge the issue, especially because these are questions that face us on a day-on-day basis. So it's not uncommon for us to stand in the court and face this while we're facing judges as well as clients and the everyday challenge. So there are two questions actually. One, a short, cheeky one, which I'd probably asked you towards the end, but more importantly, as we see the COVID situation emerge, we're also seeing that some of the fundamental functions of the judiciary have started moving online. But given that internet penetration is not everywhere and it's not free, how do you see the evolution of the process of justice in the next maybe about 2 years to 5 years framework? And how do you see that actually working out in terms of dynamics of society versus judiciary? That's one of the few things that I'd really like to hear your thoughts on.
Again, it's a big question, Harish, because, and it's not one that you can answer by making a very general statement, except to this extent. Will there be more online facilities in relation to court processes? The answer has got to be yes. What are they and or what should they be? I think it's going to very much depend. For administrative processes like, you know, sort of registrars' hearings and things like that, quite obviously you're going to be able to do a great deal of that online, and that will have a satisfactory, that will have an impact on I think, containing costs. Can you have big court cases online? I think it's going to be limited. You can do it, but I think it's going to be limited. And I think you'll find that for the most part, everybody will get back into the court. Then you're going to have court delays. So I think there's a real challenge for the court processes to be efficient. It's one of the things that I tried I had a very simple message when I was president of the Court of Appeal. This is an efficient court. You have a problem, then we'll make sure the processes work for you. Now, it was at the appellate court, so you can tailor things a little bit more directly. But I am hearing all sorts of things. I'm hearing, for example, from the Chief Justice of the Family Court here in Australia, that he thought that something like 30% of cases could go online. That, at one level, is an easier statement for him to make because the family court processes, for the most part, are confidential, and you don't then have to balance that with the concept, which is very strong here, of open justice. So, that type of thing can go on. The barristers will tell you that there is some evidence that you can take online satisfactorily enough, but when you've got a really sort of hard-fought case, and where issues of credit and the like are involved, it's not going to be easy online. The barristers also tell me that it takes much more preparation to run a full online case because everyone's got to have the same documents. Everybody's got to be able to pull them up. You're making many more bundles of documents. Achievable, but at the end of the day, I can't see it being the manner of process going forward. To reiterate, my view is that this is the real challenge for courts to become much more effective, much more efficient.
Thank you so much. And my cheeky question here is that if you are writing to schools, what can we do to get on your postal list?
Listen, we're social media groupies here. So we have a Government House Facebook, we have Instagram, we have videos, all sorts of things.
TikTok, but I don't think they're going to be able to receive it in India at the moment.
Yes.
Thank you, Talish. So the next question's from Joseph Parwell, who's a councillor, Hume City Council and AIYD 2020 delegate. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, thanks very much for being with AIYD this afternoon. Although it has frequently been said that a virus like COVID-19 does not discriminate and has the ability to reach far and wide, some commentators and analysts have also argued that the most vulnerable and socio-economically disadvantaged will, by the end of the pandemic, have borne the brunt of its adverse impacts physically, socially, and economically. My question is, in the framework of social justice and in the context of the post-COVID-19 recovery phase, whenever that occurs, what do you think can be done to ensure that the most vulnerable in our societies do not experience even greater disadvantage and inequality?
Look, it's everyone's got the big questions this afternoon. I think that is very difficult. If you take the approach of the New South Wales government, but I think it's probably one you find in other places, they see big projects as the way to keep the economy going and probably to reinvigorate it. Now, that means that you've got to have a workforce which is able to respond and to work in those big projects. So I suspect that you're going to have a lot more underpinning, probably not only educationally, but I think much more health-wise and in terms of programs for socially disadvantaged, which is going to ensure that people who would normally be socially disadvantaged are going to be able to lift themselves up and carry themselves into an economy which is going to be working. Now, how do you do that? The answer to that is not easy. My own feeling is the programs which are directed to childhood literacy are probably some of the most important programs that we could be investing in at the moment to ensure, and when I say childhood literacy, you can actually take that through even to teenager literacy. And the more literate your community is, I think the more adaptable your community is going to be. And, you know, so the jobs are going to change in any event. And so you're going to have a community and a generation which is going to be adaptable. That's only going to happen if you have really strong supports underneath that, particularly in literacy, which is both literacy and numeracy, I think. And in some ways, that's part of the answer to Sean's question as well, I think. And, you know, this is not the time to drop those programs. This is the time to reinforce them. So that's very basic. But I'm really talking about, you know, programs in high school, literacy programs in high schools and the like. When you get figures of people coming out of high school, you know, sort of barely being able to read, and that's got to change in our community. Sure, the education system is supposed to accommodate that. It doesn't always. And there are some just fabulous programs out there, not-for-profit programs, which are supporting it. That's where we all should be putting our efforts, I think, on one of the places.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Joseph. So our last question is from Payal Mahindru, AIYD 2012 and Senior Legal Counsel, Westpac. Payal, over to you.
So my big questions have both been asked and answered, and they were mainly around the use of technology. So I'll fall back to my third question, which is, obviously, Your Excellency, there have been many emergency measures that have been implemented in response to COVID-19, both in India and Australia, and of course around the world. So this is a fairly broad question, but I'm interested to hear Your Excellency's views on how do you see the rule of law continuing to coexist, if at all, with the implementation of these sorts of emergency responses in a post-COVID world, or what the legal profession might do differently?
Yeah, well, you've got onto one of my favourite topics, is the rule of law.
Excellent.
Because I actually think the rule of law tends to be a bit misunderstood. I mean, maybe would it be putting too much upon you, me to ask you what you think the rule of law embraces or covers? Because I'd be just interested to sort of get the sense of other people's understanding of it.
Sure, of course. So my understanding is that it's ensuring or facilitating access to justice in a fair, non-discriminate way across the board, and ensuring that there's not a misuse or an abuse of power, in a sense. And that's quite broad.
I certainly agree with the second. I sometimes like to keep the rule of law as a fairly tight concept, but to a certain extent this is semantics, but I really like to look at the rule of law as being something where the first principle is nobody's above the law. And so that means Mr. Morrison's not above the law, the courts aren't above the law, Mr. Trump is not above the law, although he seems to find that difficult to understand. And that's why the judgment in the US Supreme Court just the other day was so significant when he was told that he had to respond to a subpoena, and he had to respond to it because he's not above the law. And a subpoena is an order of the court, as you would well know. So that's the first part. No one is above the law. The second part is that no one should be arbitrarily dealt with by the law. And that means that you can't have someone come in the middle of the night and take you away for no reason. You can't have your property taken away for no reason. There has to be some reason, some adjudicative process that enables that to happen. The other things that you talk about are often considered to be part of the rule of law. I actually see it as being part of the way it's really the administration of justice, because the rule of law sits on top of the administration of justice, and justice has to accommodate all those who come before it. And that's why you have concepts such as access to justice and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, do you say we're a country not governed by the rule of law because legal aid's not available to everybody? I don't think so. And that's why I think it's better to keep it as a more pristine concept, and then you work it out underneath. I don't know that there's going to be much difference in Australia insofar as the rule of law is concerned. My impatience with the way people use the rule of law is it's usually used by politicians when they want to target a particular group and who may be not being respectful and or sort of not obeying the law. That's where you tend to hear it used by politicians. It doesn't actually mean that. It doesn't mean that everybody has to obey the law. It actually means that people can't be arbitrarily dealt with by the law, and that they, the politicians, are not above the law. So Australia, we're all right. There are other countries where one could be a bit more doubtful, and at least from the leader's point of view. I mean, Mr. Trump gives us a lot of material. Would you say because he said he could go down Fifth Avenue and shoot whoever he liked and not be accountable? That wasn't quite what he said, but it was close to what he said. I think he said I'd still get the same number of votes. But he was basically saying I'm a rule unto myself. Does that mean the rule of law doesn't operate in America? Well, I think it does, but you just happen to have one leader. And then the question is how that filters down into the society. So I think this is a big societal question. But questions about access to justice, are we going to have problems around that because we're spending all our money on trying to respond to COVID? One might expect legal aid is going to be much more limited in the future. And that is going to have real impacts, which actually means we are, again, as a society, going to have to step up. And I think that's something that's happening in our society now. I think a lot of the community support is expected to come from the community itself. That's why you have community legal centres to the extent that you do. That's why you have these sort of huge array of not-for-profit organisations, and many, go back to my example a moment ago, who are working in the area of literacy, things like that. I think we really are having a concept of government, which is smaller government, greater community support, internal community support. Yeah. I don't think that means that the rule of law is there. I don't think that means there's any infraction of the rule of law. Over time, it could be if the society starts to fall apart because it doesn't have the internal supports. And you switch on the television. This is not to me. This is neither an expert statement nor a political statement, but you see the Prime Minister of Lebanon saying our society is failing because of all these things. So is it happening in Australia? I don't think so. Should we ever take the rule of law for granted? I don't think so. Should we always ensure that we, as a community, are responding to needs? I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you so much, Your Excellency. Certainly some existential questions for us to consider in relation to the application of the rule of law. Thank you so much. This has been so, personally, particularly exciting afternoon. But before I get scolded, I'm going to hand over formally to Mitali, who's going to close for us. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Mitali, over to you.
Thank you, Sanushka, and thank you, Your Excellency. Indeed, that was a really 360 conversation. I think we got into the depth and breadth of so many issues. It was fantastic to hear you guys. I thought I might...
I think that was 360 and back again.
And back again. I thought I might have lined up, some smart lawyer quip, but considering the amount of legal acumen that there is gathered in this community here, I think I'll just avoid that and instead bring on forth as I mentioned, our founding members are one part of AIYD's roots, and the other very, very strong part of our roots is our distinguished partners. Macquarie has been with us right from the start, So it is my great pleasure indeed to invite to deliver the vote of thanks Professor Philomena Lee Young. She's been in the academic community since the 1970s. She's worked with a wealth of universities and, of course, with Macquarie over the last few years. It is indeed our pleasure and privilege to have Macquarie and Professor Philomena within our family. Over to you.
Thank you, Mitali, and thank you again, Your Excellency. I think the conversation is so revealing, and also it reflects your personal value as well. And I think I personally very much like the way how you mentioned about the messaging video, the humanity way of looking after the regional town, although it's directly not related to perhaps today's topic, but it shows that the value and culture, and also how you personally look at the vulnerabilities, especially from COVID-19, and that has actually shown how important it is to us. And you mentioned about technology, and also how perhaps the courts and also the justice system have changed and adapted to the very fast developing world of online. And that is actually very good to know, and very pleasing that you are actually able to manage so much of those changes. But at the same time, with respect of governance, I think your view about having the government in the ecosystem of the government and also the private sector to collaborate is actually extremely important. And I think that actually shows, even though when we look at the automation and also the AI system, where I understand that you are navigating the 29 pieces of the Commonwealth legislation, and it actually shows that you also understand the importance of having analysis in the input stage rather than the output stage, and also the suggestion that perhaps the regulators will need to look at a place where they can go and for assistance where there is an ethical stand. And I think that is something which is very refreshing. The other thing that has been alluded to during the conversation is about also diversity within the governance sector. And of course, in terms of governance, you mentioned culture, value, and I think that mindset, which is behind perhaps the board, and also when you talk about the blockade, which may mean that some of the cases in terms of harassment may have to be addressed in a more perhaps fundamental way. And you mentioned also in terms of the Women's Lawyers Association's recommendation about their bystanders approach for the policy, and that is actually very useful for me to understand further that perhaps there are a lot of complications and of course complex factors to consider in terms of the consequences of both governance and diversity, and also perhaps in terms of the automated decisions that were made. The AIYD's ability to have all the combined resources is what you actually has taught us tonight. And because through the question by Sean Starr, you refer that we have our role to actually highlight not just education, the community and the rule of law, and that the areas that we can actually promote is basically what we're good at in terms of relations and interactions between government, community, and of course between the business environment, and on research, scientific research on law, technology, language, and also in terms of literacy and numeracy. And of course, the last question on the rule of law is something which I also have learned a lot in terms of the practical way of understanding the rule of law, and to understand also some of the perhaps the misinterpretation of what is meant by the rule of law. And again, the culture, the value, and what is behind the Australian judicial system. And it is very pleasing to know that Australia has been able to uphold the high standard of judicial and corporate governance system as much as we can. And of course, we learn some way on the way, but I'm sure that this conversation is very very valuable to us. And I'm sure that all of us actually enjoy listening to the conversation. And I hope Your Excellency also enjoy having this conversation with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Philomena. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hand over to Mitali. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Philomena. Thank you very much for that, Philomena, and partners who joined this conversation today. A special thanks to Sanushka for moderating this conversation and really steering through some quite emotional issues, but doing it with so much depth, as you always do. And a very, very special thanks indeed to Her Excellency for taking the time out and being so gracious with sharing so many things with us. I think we've all come away richer having had this experience with you. The full conversation will be posted online for anyone who missed out. But my thanks again to everyone, and we can call it curtains now on the conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you.